Hello. Before we get down to cinema, I would like to draw your attention to our Patreon. Regular listeners will know that these podcasts are supported by Quad, our home cinema in Derby, UK. But as Quad is a charity, we want to make Cinelit as self-sustainable as possible. So, to that end, we have set up a two-tier way in which you can support Cinelit. For our 35mm Cine fans, you'll get a bonus additional episode each month where we will be deep diving into an area of cinema that will be exclusive to Patreon subscribers for at least 6 months before it arrives like a late dinner guest on the regular feed. Plus, you get the episodes a week in advance of the main feed release. But if you want to support us and don't feel that pressing need to have the additional podcast each month, but still want that warm, satisfying feeling of being part of the Cinelit success story, then you can become an 8mm Cine fan, where you can donate and get our heartfelt thanks. Head over to the Patreon page and subscribe if you can. However, we know that times are hard at the moment, so please do not feel you need to subscribe if you are not able. We'll still be putting out new, free-to-listen-to episodes on a regular basis throughout the year. Now let's get back to your regular scheduled broadcast. Hello and welcome to another suspense-filled episode of A Cinelit. We are discussing Hitchcock's Vertigo, not just for random reasons. We're not just plucked it out of thin air, like we do with many of the other podcasts we do. But this one, we figured we'd start to take a look at some of the films that are dominating the top 20 list of the Sight and Sound Critics Poll and Directors Poll that's conducted every 10 years, with the next one due this November in 2022. And in a shock change to the old guard in 2012, Vertigo pipped Citizen Kane to the top of the critics poll for Sight and Sound chart. So we thought we'd start with Vertigo and Hitchcock. We've already covered The Wrong Man and The Trouble with Harry on our Patreon exclusive podcast. So if you are interested in more Hitchcock, then do check out that and sign up for our Patreon. But we're talking about arguably his masterpiece. I mean, critics are fairly unanimous in that. My name is Adam Marsh. I am joined today by Daryl Buxton. How are you, Daryl?
Yeah, I'm fine, thanks, Adam. Yeah, really looking forward to this. Vertigo is like a top 10 favourite for me, if not top 3.
Wow.
Yeah, Hitchcock's masterpiece, although not everybody agrees. So.
Yeah, I must admit, it's not my favourite Hitchcock for a start. And I'm not sure whether I enjoy it that much. I watched it again in preparation for this, and I did enjoy it, but I think one of the things about it didn't draw me in. I was sitting there watching it critically. So I was sitting there watching, oh, that's a really clever use of mise-en-scene. Oh, that's a really interesting use of special visual effects. And they've introduced that dolly cam zoom effect to induce vertigo in the viewers. That's really interesting. It didn't draw me into the story.
Yeah, but you've used the word enjoy there, and then you've talked a lot about the sort of technicalities of the film, and I actually think that's what it's about, and I think that's part of its appeal to a certain type of viewer, mainly movie critics. I think it's not an enjoyable film. It isn't. It's not supposed to be, and I think you are supposed to be in awe of its sort of technical aspects and some of the sort of trickier experimental techniques that Hitchcock's bringing into this. I mean, to get onto it as a sort of narrative story, for starters, it opens with this incredible chase scene. And one thing I'd like to point out about the chase scene is I think it's a rip-off of the opening scene of a Friz Freleng Warner Brothers cartoon from 1954 called Satan's Waiting, which has Sylvester the cat chasing Tweety Pie across a bunch of telegraph wires onto the roof of a skyscraper, and then running along the edge of the skyscraper, and then Sylvester falls off. And it's almost shot for shot the opening of Vertigo 4 years early.
Wow. Okay.
So check out Satan's Waiting, and thematically as well, the way the scene is used and the sort of length of the scene sort of fits in with the way that Hitchcock uses his scene in Vertigo. I think the great thing for me about Vertigo is that that opening scene, it has the first person we see on screen is Steve Conte, who's a sort of well-known bit part player and well-known TV actor of the 50s. And he's playing this character, sometimes called the fugitive or the burglar. And we see him sort of climbing onto the roof first, pursued by a uniformed cop, and then pursued by Jimmy Stewart. And he gets away because Stewart's left dangling on the edge of the skyscraper, about to fall to his doom. The cop stops his pursuit of the villain, who escapes. So we're already getting the message here that this film's not going to be conventional. The bad guys get away, and the good guys, as we see with the cop, fall to their deaths. Things don't go well for the good guys here, for the voice of authority.
So what you're saying, Daryl, is that Vertigo 2, where they get the criminal, is the one to really watch, if that's part of the story you want to follow.
Interesting you say that, Adam, because I think there's a possible alternative here. In that, one or two critics, and I'm right along with them on this, I don't think any of Vertigo happens. I think we're watching the dying dream of Jimmy Stewart's character, Scotty. I think he falls to his death in the movie. Hitchcock shows him hanging on. He shows the copper trying to rescue him, who fails and falls. And then Jimmy Stewart's just left dangling in midair, 100 feet off the ground, you know. One or two sort of analysts of the film have compared it to the famous Ambrose Bierce story, an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, where the protagonist escapes hanging, the rope breaks. It's a sort of American Civil War story. He escapes hanging when the rope breaks and he falls into a river, and then he sort of swims off and he goes off in search of his wife. And then he sort of embraces his wife at the end of the story, having found her, and her embrace turns into the noose, and he's suddenly back there being hung, and the whole story hasn't happened. And I think that's the case with Vertigo. There is a take on it that says that we never see what happens to Jimmy Stewart's character. We never see him rescued, and then we just suddenly fade out of that opening scene, which is completely disconnected to the rest of the story. And the only connection is that the inference is that it's this incident that gives him his vertigo, his fear of heights, which then does feed into the story. But yeah, there is a reading of Vertigo that says none of it happens. It's all in his head as he's dangling and presumably then falls, and these are his final thoughts as he sort of plummets to the ground. So yeah, I mean there is I think possibility for further expansion on Vertigo. Now, one thing I'd love to see, I know that there was a fairly recent novel that looked at the Madeleine character played by Kim Novak and sort of filled in her backstory a little bit. And I don't know if that's a story I want to read. What the alternative story I'd like to see is the Barbara Bel Geddes character, Midge. I'd love to see a version of Vertigo through her eyes.
Yeah,
I think that would be very sort of Hitchcockian and very interesting, because she's the Jimmy Stewart character's former fiance. They're still friends. They sort of have digs at each other all the way through the movie. And she's presented as a very sort of uptight sort of person. She wears those great sort of 50s specs, very sort of severe looking specs. You know, she's very sort of straight-laced and sort of tight buttoned up. She designs 1950s restricted bras as her job. That's her employment. And compare that with the various Kim Novak characters, who are very sort of free-spirited and who pointedly, if that's the word here, don't wear bras. You've got this immediate comparison between these two characters fighting for the affections of Jimmy Stewart, although in by no means a conventional love story type way.
No.
Yeah, we've got all that sort of process before we even get started talking about the main body of the film.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Maybe we should just like summarize the film for those people who haven't seen Vertigo.
Now you're talking, because I think you can summarize a lot of films. Let's summarize Jaws, for instance. 3 guys go off and hunt a shark. Let's summarize E.T. An alien comes down to Earth and befriends a small boy. You can pack that into a few words. Let's summarize Vertigo. We ain't going to get that in a dozen words.
Well, no, but not all movies do. I mean, this movie it's about James Stewart's character, who is a former police officer. We see him, as Daryl has explained, we see him at the start of the movie. So he suffers from acrophobia. As Daryl, it probably started in this opening sequence as a way of laying that as a plot point for the rest of the film. He becomes a private detective. He's hired by an old friend to follow his wife, who he's told is obsessed with a dead woman who died many years ago, and at age 26, at the same age of this wife, and she's going to commit suicide. So he's been hired to follow her to make sure she doesn't commit suicide. And spoiler, he fails. She commits suicide. It's a nightmare. It's a trauma. And he's upset by the whole situation. And then sees another woman on the streets who looks very much like the Madeline Elders character.
Yeah.
The Elders. The Kim Novak character. So who looks very much like her and starts to follow her. And then in what is not a spoiler, the film tells you this as you're going through. It is the same woman. She hasn't committed suicide. She confesses it in a letter halfway through the movie. The big twist, the big reveal is there in the movie right halfway through. But then she decides to carry on having a relationship with James Stewart. And he starts to reshape her in the vision of what Madeline looked like, with blonde hair and grey suits and that kind of stuff. Yeah, that's the basic plot. As you say, not on the back of a postcard. It's not Die Hard in a building, is it? It's not terrorists invade a building.
Sure.
One man fights back. It's
and I mean, at the point you've stopped doing a synopsis there is just about the point where it starts getting really weird.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you mentioned there the character of Madeline, Judy, and Carlotta, the sort of the dead ancestor. This turns into a possession story for a while as well. One of the early sort of possession movies, even though it's a fake possession. It's which is brilliant. So we've got this Madeline character, Kim Novak. Not the world's greatest actor. I think she's great in this, and it's a really, really challenging role.
Well, I think the roles are fairly vacant roles anyway.
Yeah.
There's not James Stewart in some ways fills the character with what he wants the character to be.
Yeah.
So Novak being maybe not the best of actresses.
It's a fit for this. It doesn't need Grace Kelly or Ingrid Bergman, does it? So,
or Vera Miles, actually.
yeah, of course.
As the original choice for the movie.
Yeah. Jimmy Stewart, though, he's got his identities throughout this film. As we say, he may even die at the start of the film. That's a possibility. That what we're seeing in the main body of the film is his own projection in his dying moments of his take on himself and his own character. One noticeable thing throughout the script is the number of different ways in which he is named or described. His name is John Ferguson. Immediately, we see him change from being a police detective to a private detective. He's called John Ferguson, but he's referred to throughout the film at various times as by both his first name and his surname, but he's also given nicknames as well. He's known as Scotty. Mm-hmm. He's called John, Johnny, Scotty, Ferguson, and various combinations of all those names. And he even refers to himself when he's having one of his sort of barbed little chats with Midge, Barbara Bel Geddes, and they're talking about relationships and should they get married and things like that. Should they get married to other people? Now they're not going to tie the knot with each other, And he actually refers to himself at one point as available Ferguson, which I think is his very, very best sort of identity. And I think the script giving him all of these different identities sort of springing out of this very basic name, John Ferguson, is a sign that he's got as much going on as Madeline. You know, he's as confused as Madeline about who he is and what his place is in the world. He sort of knows himself perhaps less well than other people do. I think Midge knows him better than he knows himself.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things where it's just like the identity is obviously a major part of this movie, as you say, both from obviously the dual character that Kim Novak's playing, but like you say, like there's paths to what at least one of these characters. I mean, with Jimmy Stewart's character, he has those other lives that we told about. Oh, that was the life when I was a police officer. That was the life when we were engaged to be married at college. You know, it's like there's all these other lives that don't seem to fit with who he is in the moment.
Yeah. It's terrific, because this could have easily been Rear Window Mark II, couldn't it?
Yeah.
And yet it goes way. I mean, Rear Window's a masterpiece of suspense, but and it's a great character piece for Jimmy Stewart. But this is just something else. You know, this could have easily been a repeat of that character. You could have almost had the same character again. You know, but what happens in Vertigo and what happens with Ferguson is just beyond the realm of anything that Hitchcock or James Stewart had ever done before.
Yeah, I mean, this was the fourth time they collaborated, so maybe it was like getting to that point where, well, if we're gonna do something together again, it needs to be something different.
It's got to be special. Yeah. And I think Stewart again is a good fit for this. I mean, Hitchcock had got his favourite actors, Cary Grant, I suppose, around this time as well. You can't imagine Grant for 1 second remotely in this part, can you? It's a Stewart. Jimmy Stewart could play the Cary Grant parts. I don't think Cary Grant could play these extreme Jimmy Stewart parts. I don't even think Cary Grant could have played something like Harvey in 1950. You know.
Well, I think Cary Grant doesn't have that. He doesn't have that vulnerability of his character. It's a very forceful character. He knows who he is. We know who he is, and that comes across on screen in his performances. And I think in this movie, Jimmy Stewart is vulnerable. He doesn't know who he is. He doesn't know what's going on.
And Hitchcock, of course, deals with both sides of that type of character. So yeah, he would either be making a Cary Grant movie or a James Stewart movie, you know, and not always with those actors either. But I think there'd always be the character at the centre of his film would either be a sort of very confident man or a very haunted man. And here we've got the sort of haunted guy, you know.
Yeah. This is an interesting movie. I mean, it's one of those ones where it's. We talked about this briefly before we started the podcast, in that you can see why critics like it, but equally you can see why it was mixed reviews on release, didn't do that well at the box office, and was shelved for years until the early 80s when it was re-released.
Well, this was down to Hitchcock actually having the rights to the film, wasn't it? The 5 films that were shelved were Rope, The Trouble with Harry, Vertigo, Rear Window, and Man Who Knew Too Much, the 50s remake. And Hitchcock held the rights to those, which is why they weren't available for many years. I wonder why he chose not to let these films out. You'd think if you'd made Rear Window, you'd want people to see it.
I think it was just one of those ones where it was like monetizing films after release wasn't really a thing. So once they'd flopped, in many cases, these cases weren't big release. You know, some of them, they made money, but they weren't massive hits.
Yeah,
they just got shelved in the sense of like, well, I own the rights, so they're going to go on the shelf, and no one's knocking on my door saying I want to re-release Vertigo in 1973 or something like that. And it was only really home video when that came in the late 70s, early 80s.
We know from the Sight and Sound polls you've just gone through with me the some of the older results. Pre-1984, pre the re-release, Vertigo was getting into those polls or getting around. Well, you know, it was in.
Yeah, I think what it was. I mean, there's many reasons why it wasn't initially embraced. I think it was very experimental in some ways, and or general audiences were, and then it kind of disappeared. And I think the growth of sort of like film theory culture particularly in America and in the 60s and 70s.
I suppose post the French New Wave, post Cahiers du Cinema.
Exactly. I think that was people starting to enthusiastically look at films and try to dig out the auteur theory, and find out the American auteurs and the Western auteurs, as opposed to just French guys.
And here's the perfect movie for
exactly
that. Yeah. This is the one, isn't it?
So I mean, like in the early 70s, it was just bubbling under the sort of like top 10 Sight and Sound poll in 72.
I think people in the know could still see it. I've read people like Steven Spielberg have sort of, borrowed prints from the studio archive and things like that. So you could see it if you wanted to, and if you were in the business, and if you knew someone who knew someone. But I mean, I guess, we've talked in the past about Richard Franklin and how he was sort of friendly with Hitchcock, the director of Patrick and Psycho 2. And you know damn well that Richard Franklin was seeing all these films in the 60s and early 70s. So they were available to people who wanted them, but just not to people like us.
Franklin was at UCLA, wasn't he?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of those directors were, and I wouldn't be surprised if there was a print there, and that got brought out and played fairly regularly.
They'd have probably had classes on it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I mean, so it's trajectory from flop, mixed reviews, no audiences really engaging with it, to topping the Sight and Sound poll in 2012 was a slow progression one. It was like bubbling under in 72, didn't even chart anywhere close in 62. 82, it was just in the top 10 at number 9. 10 years later in 92, it was up to number 4.
Post re-release.
Re-release.
So a whole new swathe of people had seen it. Yeah,
and then 10 more years in 2002, it was number 2, and then number 1 in 2012, dethroning Citizen Kane. So it's had a long run. I wonder whether it'll still be there in November when they do the new charts. I doubt it, to be honest.
There's the question, because let's talk about some of the contentious issues here. And I think the big one is the way in which Ferguson manipulates or thinks he's manipulating, because of course he isn't, but he thinks he's manipulating the Judy character and turning her into Madeline. And it's the most warped obsession that any Hitchcock character has ever had. I think even more so than the stuff Norman Bates is doing in Psycho. It's just it's.
Well, the thing is, I think what's fascinating about it is it's so upfront.
Yeah,
there's no sort of like hide your shame. It's none of that. It's none of that. It's like, this is what we're doing, Judy. I'm going to turn you into the vision of this dead woman that I loved, and you're going to go along with it.
Yeah, and she does. Yeah, with it. But then we understand why at the end of the movie. But while it's happening, we don't understand why. And I think certainly a lot of feminists and a lot of feminist critics take against the movie because of that, because they respond to what they're seeing on screen at any particular time, rather than a lot of people write about this film in terms of what's happening on screen at this point, and this point, rather than taking a more sort of holistic approach and looking at the whole thing after they've watched it, looking back at the trajectory of Madeline's journey through Carlotta and through Judy, and the reasons why she's doing what she does.
What are the reasons? Are those reasons strong enough to justify it, to justify her as a character going along with it? I don't think they are.
I think in cinematic terms and in terms of the effect of this story, I think they're wonderful. But if you're trying to put realism into this, basically, if you're saying on the one hand, again, we're back to the start of the movie. Are you a person who thinks this is all Scotty's dying dream? Or are you a person who thinks this is really happening? And if you think it's really happening, no, those points aren't strong enough. If this is all in Scotty's head, it makes more sense.
I don't think it is a dream. I don't think there's enough in the rest of the movie to indicate that this is a fiction.
Well, one argument in favour of that is the ending of the film. We'll talk about the specifics of the ending later because they're wonderful. But the fact that you don't see any resolution for Scotty. If it is a dream, you don't see him sort of wake up at the end. So which sort of suggests that maybe it isn't. Maybe it is all supposed to be real. But this all leaves itself open to discussion because it is open-ended like that, and it's not resolved in any conventional sense. And yet there is this possibility that it is all a fantasy. But then, as you say, you've got these contentious aspects surrounding the Judy character and the way that she is seemingly being manipulated by a sort of male, almost like father figure. This is the thing with Hitchcock's casting. Grant and Stewart aren't young guys, are they? They're and so when you see them in films with Grace Kelly or with Ingrid Bergman or with Kim Novak here, there is that extra little level of creepiness to it. They're sort of madly in love with this character, and yet aren't they 20 years too old for her? And here I think that's really pointed, and the fact that Judy goes along with it, when you're taking that at face value before you know what's happening in the film, it's really, really disturbing. And I think that disturbance stays with a lot of viewers and with a lot of critics.
Yeah,
and especially the more feminist-oriented ones.
Well, is that sort of like a deliberate decision, or is it just like, oh, fuck it, it's 50s Hollywood? You know what I mean? It's like he's the star, she's the new hot up-and-coming actress. We put them together. That's fine. We don't give a shit. We got Fred Astaire alongside Audrey Hepburn. It's like 60 years difference or whatever it was. It's ridiculous. Henry Fonda in The Wrong Man. Certainly. I think Hitchcock had definite things in mind with Vertigo, as he often did with his films. These things didn't all happen by accident. But I think in this case, the casting probably was. It was just conventional Hollywood, but I think then it's another layer for critics to then look at and pick at, isn't it? Well, I think it's one of those things where did Hollywood have actresses in their 40s on hand?
Well, no, and it didn't really have a swathe of younger men. It was very much a situation like it is now, where the big stars in cinema today are still Tom Cruise, Nicolas Cage, Keanu Reeves, who are all pushing 60. And it was like that back then. There was this sort of older generation that had been making films since the 30s, was still current and still popular at the box office. John Wayne you can throw in there as well, alongside the Grants and Stewarts. And there wasn't really a generation of up-and-coming young actors. And if there were, it was people like James Dean, and it was the Method School, who weren't really capable of and weren't really interested, I think, in playing the sort of romantic male lead. They all wanted to be the character actor. They wanted to do something different. So what you'd not got was a generation of actors coming up underneath Cary Grant and Jimmy Stewart that wanted to play those sort of roles. So if you had a romantic lead in a movie, the pool of actors that you were drawing from were all in their late 40s and early 50s,
Yeah, and like I said, like there was no age appropriate casting options really. From a Hollywood star point of view, kind of thing. Which is it's fascinating. It's very, very similar to the discussions around recent Top Gun movie with Tom Cruise and Jennifer Connelly. They've cast the actress over 50. That's amazing, well done. But she's the one over 50 who looks like she's late 30s. You know what I mean? It's not exactly.
They've not brought Kelly McGillis back, have they?
No, not at all.
So I mean, there are parallels here between the sort of modern era, and I don't think audiences notice either. I don't think people that are going to see Keanu Reeves movies now think, oh, who's this old guy in the suit shooting everyone? They think, oh, doesn't Keanu look cool? And I think they did with Jimmy Stewart and Cary Grant in the Hitchcock films.
Okay.
Nobody thought, who's this old guy? They thought, oh, it's the new Jimmy Stewart film. Great.
Okay. Let's move away from the actors and the performance into the slightly more experimental aspects of this, because that's kind of what's pushed this one to the top of the charts, as opposed to, say, Rear Window or North by Northwest or something like that. it's the more experimental stuff. It's those things. I mean, oh my God, this is amazing. The critics have really latched on to that kind of use of the French New Wave-esque style of filmmaking alongside Hitchcock's traditional thriller, suspenseful film.
And out and out surrealism as well at times.
Yeah, absolutely.
Genuine surrealism, and surreal is an overused word. This is Buñuel-esque at times. It really is. And Hitchcock had worked with Salvador Dali, of course, on Spellbound, and it shows here. He's not forgotten. There's a lot of that in here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some of the set pieces are beautiful. I'm assuming they're similar. It starts with the opening credits, doesn't it? I mean, it sets the tone straight away. It starts in black and white, and then you have that blood red filter over the top, and then you have those wonderful Saul Bass opening credits.
Yeah, with the great coloured spirals.
Background.
Yeah. Like he's gone mad with the spirograph.
Exactly. Yeah. Is it Uzumaki? Obsession with spirals. Yeah, just utterly sets the tone straight away.
Yeah, and then Hitchcock's own credit emerging from a giant eyeball as well, which is none more Un Chien Andalou, it's none more Salvador Dali.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and like you say, I mean, also adding to the sort of like critics and the sort of like regard, it is Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo.
Yeah,
it's not like the writers of Les Diaboliques, which was based on the story of that. So they had a name, they've got a cachet, but no, this is Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo, and even back in 1958, setting the tone.
And then after the credits have finished, the very first thing we see on screen is an iron bar across the screen, gigantic iron bar on screen, and it's almost a challenge to the audience. It's almost saying, this is impenetrable. You're not going to get through this. The next 2 hours are going to be tough. We're putting this obstacle in the way to prove it. And then you see this pair of hands grip the bar, and it's a bit part player. It's Steve Conte, a sort of TV bit player. It's not Jimmy Stewart. It's not Grant. It's not a big major name. And then you get into the whole chase scene that we've already talked about. Then there's this idea that is it all a dream? Is it all Jimmy Stewart's dream? And then we're off and running, and so I mean, what particular set pieces and particular scenes stand out for you then?
Well, the 1960s Batman ones, I think ones where it feels like he's got all this crazy sort of like Batman TV show-esque visuals with Jimmy Stewart going like crazy, I guess.
Yeah.
They were pretty special. And they're like, oh my God, this is animation in a mainstream thriller. As an audience member, you sit there thinking, what is this? Why has it suddenly become like a Disney cartoon or something?
Yeah. Very, very strongly copied, I think, by George Romero in Creepshow in the 80s, who was striving for that EC horror comics style with what he did, but it actually ended up looking more like Vertigo.
Yeah. It certainly shot the movie through with like, what is going on? It reinforces that you don't know what's going on at all, do you? And even if you're tricking along, following it, thinking, okay, this is really good, I'm enjoying this. Yeah. Jimmy Stewart's got his little plot line going on, and suddenly it just off it goes off the edge of a cliff.
Viewers at the time would have seen Rear Window, and they'd have seen Man Who Knew Too Much, and they'd have seen things like The Wrong Man. And the approach to a Hitchcock film would be, we're going to go in, we're not going to know what's going on at the start, but gradually we'll be given clues along the way, and we'll be able to guess what's happening, And in Vertigo, you're suddenly floundering, you're half an hour in, and you're thinking, Hitch isn't playing the game here, This isn't what he normally does.
He doesn't, but he does, doesn't he?
Yeah,
he's very canny.
This is the film's masterstroke, I think, is that it is a conventional Hitchcock film. If you look for that, but you really, really have to delve in amongst all the surrealism and all of the crazy sort of visuals and stuff to find that. And it's so easy to get lost in Vertigo.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sitting there watching it and thinking, obviously, this. Yes, does he really follow on from that visual style in other movies after this?
No, because I mean, North by Northwest went
Very
right back to a
yeah.
very traditional style. Then Psycho was filmed with this TV crew in black and white.
I mean, I can see the comparisons with Psycho on this, because particularly the sort of like structure of the script. I mean, you have halfway through this movie, you have that big confession, and the twist ending happens an hour in. You know, you've got another hour to go. Yeah. Where and similar with Psycho, where we have that midpoint ending and then a restart of the movie, don't we?
Yeah, I suppose the closest sort of sister to Vertigo is Marnie, I would say.
Right. Okay.
In that it's got a weird psychology to it. It's got weird sort of sexual themes to it. It's got the male character treating the female lead in ways that maybe don't play well to modern audiences and perhaps didn't play particularly well to contemporary ones. And it's got amazing striking colour and use of visuals and striking imagery. So yeah, I think Marnie sort of is almost a sort of twin to Vertigo in that sense. But even then, that it doesn't come anywhere near to doing what Vertigo does.
No, I mean, like you say, it was. I don't think it was massively acceptable for audiences at the time either. In 1958, where you got the beatnik period, you got people, you got the start of that sort of like 60s rebellion movement and the feminist movement and things like that. It's just, it doesn't feel like it's speaking to the generation that are watching movies around that period.
Sure.
And I think also it's probably not speaking to a generation now either. But in the years in between that, I think maybe the auteur theory is not as in fashion as it was.
Yeah.
And I think, it requires a full buying in of the auteur theory to fully embrace Vertigo, I think.
What about Hitchcock's own personal reputation? I mean, more and more stories have come out about him over the years, and he's not a Me Too kind of guy, is he?
Well, no, he's a prime candidate for Me Too.
Oh, yeah. I think that's affecting some of the modern and younger critical response to his films. Is he potentially going to be a forgotten figure in 100 years' time?
Well, most people will be a forgotten figure in 100 years' time, Daryl. Yeah, I mean, it's like that's a hard one to judge.
But, people of his level though and his stature, I mean, Beethoven and Mozart aren't, and you sort of think, well, who's going to survive from the movies?
I think there's a separation of art and the artist. I think with Hitchcock, it's slightly more difficult because a lot of his issues that make him a prime candidate feed through into the plots of his movies. But they are movies and they are plots of movies. They are not his own documentaries, are they? So.
And as you've said, he didn't really try to hide this stuff either. It was all up front. I mean, Jimmy Stewart's almost a sort of surrogate Hitchcock in Vertigo, and he certainly isn't in Rear Window.
No,
but. Yeah, it's a difficult one. I suppose our first indication of this is going to be in the Sight and Sound poll. So it's going to be interesting for many reasons. But one of the key points of interest is Vertigo going to be number one? Is it even going to figure in the top 10? Is it going to plummet like the cop at the start of Vertigo plummets, and like Madeline plummets?
I think it will. I think it will drop. But equally, I think mainly because even in just in the last 10 years, the critics have changed.
Yeah.
You think about like 2012, maybe even 20 years ago, 2002, the internet wasn't the critics on the internet. It was all the people they were polling was still, it was the Guardian lead writer. It was the Daily Telegraph. It was the Sight and Sound writers. And that was it. Whereas like in the last 20 years, we've seen the rise of other areas of journalism and other areas of film criticism that maybe would have different takes on the canon.
Yeah. I mean, there've even been critics that have come and gone in that period of time. People like Harry Knowles, who was sort of huge 20 years ago and is almost forgotten now. The internet, I think, is going to make a big difference here. And what will be interesting, I think, is the aftermath of the poll. If Vertigo does fall, or even if it fails to make the top 10, which I think is a possibility, the debate that's going to go on about the film, I think it's going to revive debate about the film. I think it's going to have a lot of defenders coming out of the woodwork and saying, look, why why don't you like Vertigo? It's a masterpiece. And I think the conversation about that, maybe towards the end of this year and in years to come, is going to be really, really interesting, and a whole new level of debate about this film.
But it's also quite interesting because obviously Sight and Sound do a critics poll and they also do a director's poll.
Yeah.
And Vertigo is not as well liked on the director's poll as it has been on the critics poll. And the critics poll is much more reverential towards the traditional canon.
Yeah.
Of these are the great films of it, whereas the director's one is much more looser, and there's a lot more modern films in that chart.
Yeah, you'll get your Wong Kar-wai and your David Lynch in the directors' polls, whereas the critics, it tends to be Citizen Kane, Tokyo Story, that sort of thing. So,
well, that's right.
Yeah. There is this accepted sort of list of films that you're allowed to vote for. It is going to be interesting to see, I think, the response to the poll. And I mean, are we definitely saying, are we calling this here and saying that Vertigo isn't going to be the number one? And would it be a shock if it was?
I think it would be a shock. I mean, I think, to be fair, it was a shock when it took over Citizen Kane 10 years ago. But just looking at those charts from 2012. You had like Vertigo was way ahead of Citizen Kane. It wasn't even close. It was like there was like 191 critics put it in their top 5.
Yeah, it was like, oh, there's a new kid in town.
Yeah,
move over.
And Citizen Kane was 2 with 157. So it's like 40. It was quite a lot. And the critics poll, like I say, was very much like that traditional canon. You had Citizen Kane, Tokyo Story, Rules of the Game, Sunrise, 2001, Searchers, Man with a Movie Camera, Passion of Joan of Arc, and eight and a half.
The films you're supposed to like.
Well, yeah, but also looking at that chart, only one of them, in fact, none of them were any later than the 70s.
No.
2001 maybe the latest, 68. Whereas the director's poll, which is obviously much more directors, had Tokyo Story as the number one, which kind of surprised me. But it had in the top 10, it had Taxi Driver, Apocalypse Now, The Godfather. It had Mirror and Tarkovsky.
Yeah,
all in that thing, and it had it had a different vibe to that chart. It was much more modern, much more new.
And like I say, you're even getting 21st century films in there. Wong Kar-wai seems popular if you look at the sort of bubbling under sections, or you look at the individual votes that they list each contributor, don't they? And they list the films that they've picked. And if you look through those, you're seeing David Lynch in there, and you're seeing Paul Thomas Anderson and people like that. So maybe the 70s will now be the classic era in the new poll. This could be a thing. We just don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm saying there's more modern films in that these movies that are getting on towards 50 years ago.
But we still think of them as modern because we were sort of seeing these, as they came out, or in sort of repertory performances and things, and I mean, talking of which, I saw all of these Hitchcock reissues in 1984 when they came out, and I was in my early 20s at the time, and I'd a huge film fan from my teens, or even earlier. So I'd read up a lot on film in books and magazines, as you did then, and watched a lot of old movies on TV. And so I was aware that there were these Hitchcock films that I'd never seen. I thought, what's this Vertigo? And it's supposed to be, not only can you not see it, but it's supposed to be really, really good. Everyone says it's his best film. What's this Rear Window? Everyone says it's amazing. Why isn't it on telly? And then news came through that the 5 films were going to be reissued. I actually got to see Rear Window at the ABC in Derby. It got big, major, popular release.
Yeah.
It can't have done much box office around the country because the rest of the films went art house. But I went to see Vertigo, and Laurie Hayward, who people might remember as the first boss at the Metro Cinema when it opened in the early 80s. Laurie ran a course on the 5 missing Hitchcock films, and we all got to see them as part of the course. I think there were about a dozen of us on the evening class that he ran, and so we'd watch the film at the Metro, and then we'd go and debate it the following week in class, And I saw Vertigo. And I was stunned. It instantly became like, oh, this is one of the greatest movies I've ever seen. This is me, age 21, But I'd seen a lot by that point already. But I thought, oh, this is top 3 for me, and it still is to this day. I went into class the following week, really enthusiastic and wanting to talk to Laurie and talk to the class about it and say, oh, wasn't Vertigo fantastic? Wasn't it amazing? And the class was sort of divided, much as we've been talking about with critics and with audiences today. The class, their instant reaction to Vertigo was, half of the people seemed to be in tandem with me and saying, oh, yeah, it's Hitchcock's masterpiece, a great film, And Laurie was sort of saying that as well. And there was this other half of the class who, they actually went as far as saying, it's terrible, it's badly plotted, it doesn't make any sense, it's not as taut and tight as Rear Window, or as Psycho or The Birds or whatever. And there was no middle ground. It was either love or hate within that classroom.
Yeah, and I think that's continued on, hasn't it? I mean, it's only going to get more stark, and as nowadays, that's how movie criticism works. You either love a movie or hate a movie. There's no in between.
Yeah. The other point to mention about 1984 is it was the year that the great Hitchcock fan and acolyte and imitator Brian De Palma made his new film. We love Body Double. We love Body Double on Cinelit and at Quad, but again, not everybody likes Body Double, and this was great from De Palma. He'd been accused for years, and especially with Obsession, which is basically a remake of Vertigo, the film that he did with Paul Schrader. They pretty much remade Vertigo in the mid-70s as Obsession. And then De Palma's other films, subsequent films like Dressed to Kill and Blowout, were often being compared to Hitchcock. So 1984 comes along and the Hitchcock films gets reissued. And I love that De Palma dared to just say, right, I'm going to mash together the plots of Rear Window and Vertigo as my new film, And it's great, we love Body Double. But what a statement to make in that year, to say, okay, the Hitchcock films are back. Let's see what I can do with them, And lovely. But Vertigo had influence before that, though. I mean, Lucio Fulci's late 60s Giallo in Italy, Perversion Story, or One on Top of the Other, which I know sounds like a sort of tacky sex film, but is actually a sort of Vertigo influenced Giallo.
Yeah, is that the Marissa Mel one?
Marissa Mel, yeah. Shot in America, wasn't it? So it's got a real sort of Vertigo vibe to it. And I think Vertigo has had its influence over the years. Mel Brooks' High Anxiety, when he did his sort of Hitchcock spoof comedy, he's throwing in elements from Psycho and The Birds and Rear Window and all of these other movies. But the sort of core of High Anxiety seems to be very Vertigo orientated. So even a Mel Brooks comedy sort of rips on it. And I think after 1984, once people had seen, once the younger generation had seen the films, I think both Vertigo and Rear Window in particular became influential to a new generation as well. And you see elements of both of those films in a lot of modern cinema.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Hitch was a household name, throughout the 50s, 60s and 70s. So it's like, you knew what Hitchcock was, even if you hadn't seen that many of his films. They had the TV series.
He sold the brand so well.
Exactly. So I think spoofing Hitchcock or homaging Hitchcock, you could do it without having necessarily being massively familiar with the movies. He was a genre to himself in some ways.
Yeah. But it's interesting that even a Mel Brooks would sort of take Vertigo as his chief inspiration rather than taking Psycho or one of the better known films,
Well, maybe it's because it's got a looser a looser structure, and I think that's obviously helps in comedy a lot.
Yeah, could be, and a comic version, a sort of outright comedy version of Vertigo would be something to see, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
But I want to talk about one shot in Vertigo in particular, which is it's the point where we've been through the whole thing about Ferguson manipulating Judy and wanting to turn her into Madeline, and it's the first reveal once he's been out and bought an outfit with her, and she's gone along very compliantly, has gone along with it all, or apparently so, has gone along with it all, and she's had her hair done and her hair dyed into the blonde style of Madeline. It's been curled in the same way as Madeline's, and she's wearing the outfit that Ferguson has bought for her and forced her to wear. And when she emerges through the doorway, and it's all shot in this sort of diffused, sort of soft focus glow, and it's got this sort of greenish tinge to it. And it's almost as though you're getting a fusion of Madeline, Judy, and Carlotta just for a second. And I think it's the key shot in the film.
Okay.
And again, in terms of surrealism and experimentation and playing around with the visuals, this is a shot that you wouldn't have found in a Hitchcock film up to that point, and you didn't really find it after that either. I think this is a sort of unique moment for Hitchcock, and it really does pull together the three strands of that character just for one moment.
What do you think the inspiration was over the sort of like the Carl? I mean, I don't spoke too much about the Carlotta character, but it seems rooted in a different movie.
Yeah,
it feels like it's like Mexican melodrama or gothic melodrama type character.
Well, possession films aren't really something that we became aware of until The Exorcist, are they? There'd been a few around in the 1940s. In fact, there was a film called Spellbound, nothing to do with the Hitchcock film. There was a British film called Spellbound, which was a possession film. And then you get some of the James Mason and Margaret Lockwood type films, some of the Gainsborough films occasionally touched on female characters that may have been taken over by another personality or a figure from the past. So it was known to audiences, this sort of thing. But of course, you'd also got the whole Bridie Murphy thing going on around this time, with people being hypnotized and finding out about their past lives or multiple personalities and things like that, right at the time that Vertigo was being made. So I think people were up for something that mixed psychology with a vague sense of the supernatural.
Yeah, it did feel like it was. It just feel like it's like of its time in that tapping in something that was in the zeitgeist in that respect.
Yeah. And yet The Exorcist and that wave of possession films comes along 15 years later, and Vertigo suddenly looks ahead of its time as well.
Yeah.
Not only of its time, but it suddenly seems to sort of predict what's going to come in cinema in the future.
Yeah, I kind of put it in a different way to things like Exorcist. I think, yes, there's possession elements to it, but I don't feel that there's a direct lineage between the two. I feel I
can see that. Yeah.
Yeah. For me, it's more like, like Wuthering Heights kind of like ghosts of the past kind of elements
being used in a melodramatic sort of way, in an emotional sense.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So interesting. Okay, Daryl. So we've spent the last 50 minutes talking about Vertigo. Have we decided? Should it be number one? Should it be held in the regard it is currently held in?
Yeah, well, I'll always remember that 1984 screening and the impact it had on me, and how it sort of leapt into my all-time favourite films and has sort of stayed there over the years. And I think for me, it always will. I'm a person who, although I usually will agree with anyone making a protest about a film being, allegedly sort of sexist or sort of anti-women or whatever, I can sort of see the other side in artistic terms. As you say, it is dividing the art from the artist in some cases, or it is dividing one set of opinions from another as well. And I can judge this as a film, as a piece of art, and as such, it's a masterpiece.
Okay. I'm less convinced. I'll be honest, I'm less convinced. I haven't watched it. Obviously, I've watched it numerous times previously, but I'm watching it again this week. The movie didn't draw me in. I didn't lose myself in the movie. I was sitting there watching it from a critical point of view. And thinking, oh, that's a clever piece of mise en scene. Oh, that's a nice editing technique. Oh, it was those kind of things that I found myself thinking as I was watching it. And I know we talked about that's part of the reason why people love it. But it's like, I need more, Daryl. I need more. Yeah. I need more.
I think the film gives more. I mean, there are things like if there is this whole "is it a dream or isn't it" sort of thing, and then you see the emphasis on things like the bell tower and that crazy scene with the giant redwood trees and things, and you think, there's all this imagery in there that could perhaps be taken as phallic, but is more likely it works better if you take it as images of sort of tall things, tall structures. And there's this whole emphasis on falling from a great height, both physically and metaphorically. Yeah. And there's always every viewing of Vertigo, there's new stuff to pick out and new stuff to find, and it will remain Hitchcock's richest film for me for life.
Okay, well, on that bombshell, we will wait with bated breath to see what the Sight and Sound poll throws up in November. We're hopefully going to tackle some more of the top 15, top 20 kind of films that have been in those lists over the next few months before Sight and Sound do reveal that final list. And maybe I can even persuade Daryl to come up with his own top 20. And we can have a look at those. Cool. Thank you very much.
You don't want to know.
Thank you very much for joining me, Daryl. We will be back again in a couple of weeks' time. As I said previously, we have done 2 other Hitchcock films on our Patreon subscription service. So if you do fancy listening to that and some of the other Patreon episodes that we've done, sign up to Cinelit on Patreon. If not, check out our regular feed and do visit our Facebook page and send us any ideas for topics that you would like to see us cover, and we will try and get to them. Take care, everyone. See you next time.